All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to today's IRIM seminar. Hats off, so it's serious time. I'm overjoyed to introduce Talia Moore, a professor at the University of Michigan. She actually designed the logo on this shirt, too, so that's why I'm wearing it. She is an exceptional biologist and roboticist. Her research, as she will illustrate, crosses this really interesting intersection where we can test biological hypotheses by building really cool robots. And it's just such a neat approach to both robotics and biology. She's been recognized with the Carl Gans Award for outstanding work in comparative biology, so biomechanics. So she's really the expert at the interface of how do we understand both what like the mechanics and the physics of biology is, and how do you actually understand it from an evolutionary standpoint. So for many of us coming from computer science or controls or sort of dry engineering backgrounds, hopefully this talk will open your eyes to a whole new way of thinking about robotics. Without further ado, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Shreyas, for that amazing introduction and for inviting me to be here. This is my first time in Atlanta or on Georgia Tech campus, and I've loved my whole visit so far. The campus is beautiful. Everyone I've met with has been amazing. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So today, my talk title isn't actually quite accurate to what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll explain a little more. I'll start off with kind of the philosophy of bio-inspired design that my lab kind of tries to embody and that we're trying to promote in these fields. And then I'll switch and tell you about some specific projects that I've done at different points in my career and how they can inform robotic design. I'm a little feedbacky. Can you hear that? Okay. Should I reduce something?
Yeah, I don't know. This is a perennial problem with these microphones.
Test. Is that better?
Yeah, can y'all hear in the back?
Can you hear in the back okay? Okay, great, awesome. Troubleshot. Okay, so what we're gonna be doing is first talking, okay. Is that better? Great, thank you for the feedback. So why do we even care about bio-inspired design? There are a lot of people who work in it. Who cares? Why? There are a few different reasons. I'm not going to cover all of them today, but first, biology inspires us to achieve new functions, right? Actually, indigenous people from around the world have independently converged on this concept of snowshoes by looking at animals like the snowshoe hare that can jump and run really well on the snow. And they thought, okay, how can we learn from this snowshoe hare to create something to allow us to do the same thing, something we've been struggling with ourselves. So this is some indigenous bio-inspired design that's really, really, I think, a beautiful example of what we can learn to give us humans new functions. And of course, we've all looked at birds and tried to fly for a very long time. Biology also provides loopholes around traditional trade-offs. So if you're trying to be really, really strong, but you also want to be really flexible, maybe you want to look at some armored invertebrates and make something that is both strong and flexible at the same time. Biology hints at these fundamental principles. So if you look at a bunch of different animals of different sizes, and you take a look at their relative leg stiffness, and that's relative to their mass, you can see that it is basically the same across all animals. And you can use that to then tune the fitness of your robot and have it work on a variety of different substrates. There are many other reasons, but fundamentally, biology is the only alternative we have to human thought processes. And so if we want to get outside of the box, if we want to just think about things that are more than what's just rolling around in our heads on our own, we have to look to nature, because that's something that humans haven't created, and it gives us these cool examples to think about. I think, so there are a lot of different approaches to bio-inspired design, and it's a really new and kind of like forming field. And so what I am thinking about doing is kind of organizing the different motivations for bio-inspired robotics. The first motivation is maybe you make something that resembles biology, right? Maybe you make something that just looks like biology, and that can be really great, especially if you're doing kind of animal playback experiments and you want to create a robot that totally mimics an animal and then tweak it in a little bit to see how the animal responds. Maybe you want to make something that functions like biology, and this is a great way that we do biomechanics research. We build these physical models that function like biology does to test our understanding. We can make something that actually exceeds the functions of biology. So if we understand the mechanics of how something works in biology, and we also understand the constraints and the evolutionary history of how that thing evolved, then we can eliminate some of those constraints that are not relevant to our design solution, and then make something that exceeds the function of biology. In particular, my lab really tries to develop new design approaches based on biological mechanisms. So you're not just making one thing based on a biological thing and saying, okay, that's the end of the day, one-to-one, we're good. Instead, I'd like to really understand how biology works and use it to create a whole family of robotic systems. So it really changes how we approach design of these types of systems. And then ultimately, the thing that I really want to do the most is using robotics to discover novel biological mechanisms. And so this is a way that I like to organize my thoughts about why we do bio-inspired design. And so now I'll tell you about some test cases, some projects in which we've done some of this. And yeah, I hope you like it. And I'm not saying that any of these are better or worse things to do. All of them have wonderful function in the field and are very valuable in the field. And my lab tries to do all of these. Okay, so applications of symbiotic bio-inspired design. I'm going to tell you two sides of the same story today, and one of them starts with lizards. So the lizard story is thinking about how lizards traverse rocky terrains, and then thinking about these different moment of inertia hypotheses. So how do we improve robot performance in rocky terrains? What do we do? Maybe we think about these rocky terrains like this is the surface of Mars, right? We've got rovers that roam around on Mars, and they oftentimes have difficulty with the granular media, but they also have difficulty with these large rocks that are kind of isolated and are in the way. Perhaps we can study an animal that lives on rocks like this, like the rock agama. This is literally called the rock agama. So we brought the rock agama into the lab, and what did we find? We found that the rock agama, this is high-speed video, it can move really, really quickly over these kind of discontinuous rocks that we've placed in the trackway. It's really good at this. And so we thought, okay, this is something that we should study to understand, how is it capable of doing this? So working with my very first undergraduate student, Debbie Lee, who's now at Intuitive Surgical, we used a force platform, which we've stabilized here, and then we've got this trackway, and then we've got this kind of vertical surface with a hidey hole, because the lizards really love to run into the hidey holes. And at some point, I was kind of messy at the time, and I was putting on my gloves, and I kind of set the glove box down into the trackway there, and something unexpected happened. So the lizard jumped off of the glove box. It literally vaulted off of the glove box and slipped. We saw this weird slip, and we saw the tail come up. And we thought, wow, if I had slipped on something like that, I would have definitely face planted and not made it up to that vertical surface. But the lizard was able to bring its tail up, we thought, to maybe compensate and maintain that vertical body position. And so we were able to actually change this. So we've got this pitch up body position here on the left. And then if we train them on that, we can get that pitch up. And then we can put a high friction surface here. And then they'll overcompensate. And then they'll actually pitch down. So it works in both directions. And we thought, wow, this is really interesting. Could this be like a on-purpose mechanism, right? And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to shorten this and call this inertial maneuvering. And the hypothesis we came up with was that like maybe this tail swing is going to vary consistently with body perturbation. So we've got our plot here. We've got our normalized perturbation in degrees, and then we've got our tail rotation angle. And what we found was a very consistent pattern, a correlation between those two. So it's a really, really high and strong correlation. And so we came up with this equation to relate and predict how well the tail would be able to redirect your body. So with this, the way that it works is that your system, total angular momentum, has to stay constant while you're in the air, right? There's no inputs and outputs into the system. So your body angular velocity is your total angular momentum minus the tail angular velocity times a constant. And this constant, right there, there's your body, and then this constant is proportional to the tail moment of inertia to the body moment of inertia. So we used this equation, and we found it made really accurate predictions for our lizard. So we then made a tailed robot to test this moment of inertia hypothesis. So here's that tailed robot. This is the tailbot. It's just an RC car that had 2 motors on it, and then we co-opted one of the motors to control that tail. We used a gyroscope to sense that angular velocity, and then PD control of this carbon fiber tail with a brass weight. It had 4 tail modes: tailless, rigid, compliant, and active. And so we wanted to test, okay, is this actually how it's working? If it's something, if this is a principle, this inertial maneuvering physical principle, it should work in the robot too. So first we tried it on a compliant tail where we just had the tail on, but we didn't turn on any feedback. And when you run that robot off of a ramp, it nosedives and it crashes. There it goes, and it crashes. So, but then we activated the tail. And if you activate the tail, it's able to maintain its body pitch, and that robot landed and it drove across the room. And so we were able to get correction within 150 milliseconds without oscillation. And this like tail effectiveness metric really tells us how much stroke you're going to need to neutralize your perturbation based on the moment of inertia of your tail. And so we were able to change the different morphologies of the tail to give it different moments of inertia. And so you could have a really low moment of inertia tail, and it needs way more stroke to neutralize a small body perturbation. Or you could have a really high moment of inertia tail that has a really small stroke to neutralize that same body perturbation. And so we compared that based on the moment of inertia of the tail of the lizard to the moment of inertia of the body of the lizard. And what we found is that the lizards are within that space. So we actually built a robot that can surpass the capabilities of that lizard. And then what we found is that tails do help these robots perform many tasks. So we published this paper, and then since then, there have been a lot of tailed robots that have propagated all throughout robotics. So you've got tailed robots that jump, they turn, they recover from perturbation, they do this like very active turning, they can do barrel rolls. This has really been like a big wave in the robotics community, and what you see is they all have these rigid 1 degree of freedom tails. But I still have questions, right? I was like, okay, this is cool, and like for 10 years, I kind of let this problem kind of simmer. And in that time, I've seen lots of other animals. There have been people who've shown that other animals use inertial maneuvering too. Well, one of the things that we studied was we wanted to know if the velociraptor was also capable of doing this inertial maneuvering with its tail. Because there was ossified tendons. So these tendons have literally been turned into bone and fossilized in the tail. And there's a hypothesis that this was used as a dynamic stabilizer. And so we talked to some paleontologists, and we got a mass distribution for the body, estimated the moment of inertia, and what we found is that compared to the robot and the lizard, the dinosaur is actually probably more effective, if it had wanted to be, than the lizard, because its tail to body moment of inertia ratio was much higher. And we've seen this in many other animals too. So in bats, inertial maneuvering is really important because unlike birds that have very lightweight wings, bats have really massive wings. It's like 25% of their whole body mass is in their wings. And they can use that to do these dynamic inertial maneuvers. We've got moths. These hawk moths also do use their abdomen as an inertial appendage to do this tracking. And you've got praying mantises that transfer their moment of inertia between all these different limbs as they leap to try and strike. And this has really changed the way that we think about the locomotion of dinosaurs as well. So when I was a young kid, people were drawing dinosaurs like this, upright with maybe the tail dragging on the floor even. And now we think of dinosaurs more as kind of horizontal. Okay, so I have a repeated slide here, so I'm just going to go through this real quick. So I want to know, how does inertial maneuvering differ between different morphologies? Is the morphology actually really important? And can we look at another animal that differs a lot and learn something new about inertial maneuvering? So we're going to switch to the next part of the story, which takes place 10 years later on jerboas. And here we're talking about inertial maneuvering with a reconfigurable appendage. So yeah, how common is inertial maneuvering? We've seen it across all of these different animals, but what about jerboas? Jerboas are these incredible bipedal hopping rodents, and they're specialized for unpredictable escape trajectories. I did my whole PhD on the biomechanics of jerboas, and I'm going to condense it all for you on one slide because I want to get you invested in jerboas so we can get on to the next step. Jerboas are the only bipedal desert rodent with multiple gaits. Here's a paper where we describe them. Jerboas are ricochettal, not cursorial, which means that fruit numbers don't predict their gait transition speeds. So basically, all the assumptions that we have about steady-state terrestrial locomotion do not apply to jerboas. They are too random. Jerboa feet are specialized for transmitting high forces, which I found using dynamic finite element analysis. Jerboas have high muscle contribution to vertical leaps that are 11 times their hip height. And jerboas have unpredictable 3D trajectories in the wild, which we measure with entropy, which is basically equivalent to information or complexity. So those are their trajectories. That's literally one of the escape trajectories from the wild. Okay, so I worked for 6 years with these jerboas. And what I found was that they are not only just really super cute and agile, but they also have the longest tail to body ratio of any mammal. And they hop around, they change directions all the time. And I thought, I wonder if they use inertial maneuvering. So I went back and used that old metric that we had developed for the lizards, right? And so I said, okay, here's our jerboa, here's our metric, and here's the ratio, right? It's 0.06. The lizard was 0.275. This metric says that jerboas should not be able to use their tails for inertial maneuvering. And so I really put this aside. I thought, okay, it's not possible, it's not possible. I did other things. And then I got jerboas in my lab. And we collected this video. And what you see here is that it's moving in 3D, and it's changing its shape through time, right? These are two big differences between the jerboas and the lizards. Yeah, and so you also see this in other videos. So this is the BBC Wild Arabia. You can see much more complex. They twirl around in one direction, they twirl around in the other direction. They're making complex shapes as they're moving through complex environments. And it seems like this could be inertial maneuvering. So my central question has now become, how does inertial maneuvering work in 3D with complex tail shapes? So is it actually useful to have a reconfigurable appendage for your inertial maneuvering? In the past, jointed tails in 3D have kind of been modeled separately. So here's a paper showing kind of a simulation of a coelophysis dinosaur that kind of has like a really stiff tail, maybe with like one joint in it. And it can move in 3D, and they found that they could do some optimizations to say, okay, maybe the tail could have some function for lowering that energetic cost of locomotion. But it's an extremely simplified model, but it is in 3D. There's been another group at Virginia Tech that's been simulating these links in their tails. And what they found was as they added the number of tail links, the net rotation of that quadruped, well, they work with quadrupedal robots, so that rectangle is a quadruped, it increases. But there have been some big questions that we have here. Like, for example, in this study, they just swept the tail from one side to the other. So all of the joints their motion is correlated with their neighboring joints. So they're not independent from each other. And it's a totally prescribed trajectory that's just very simple. And so like these joints in 3D have been modeled separately, but we still have open questions. Like, does 3D tail movement enhance inertial maneuvering with respect to 2D? No one's really looked at it in 3D before. Do complex curves enhance inertial maneuvering compared to simple curves? That first paper there, or that second paper from Virginia Tech suggests that maybe, but we don't know because they didn't actually use like multiple curves along the length of the same tail. If we have two different morphologies of tails, what is the right way to compare the maximum inertial maneuvering potential for a given tail morphology? Is it enough to just give them the same motion and see what happens? What is the maximum, like the best trajectory? The best trajectory might differ for different morphologies, right? And then do complex tails require more complex control? If we want to design a tailed robot, these are all the questions that we have to answer to be able to design something really well. So the rest of my talk is actually going to be my PhD student, Dr. Shun Fu, who just defended his dissertation on Friday. So he's looking for a postdoc position. If any of you are recruiting, I'm featuring his research here to show you how incredible he is. So Shun has been working with me for the past 4 years, and we have tackled this problem from many different angles. Together we decided we're going to build a simulation in 3D. And so we're basically assuming that we have this 3D floating torso and tail in space, and we have a 2 degree of freedom tail joint here between the body and the tail. And imagine if you're like an astronaut in space with no gravity, no wind resistance or anything. The only way you can rotate your body is by moving your tail around. Okay, so that's what we're modeling here. And he came up with these different tail morphologies. So going from 1 link to 6 links, each link in between has 2 degrees of freedom. And so you can have these different tails that share the same total length and total mass, but now that mass is in these different links that are reconfigurable. And so the moment of inertia of that tail can change through time. Okay, but because we've got these different morphologies, how do we compare? So he decided to use optimization, right? So this is how he formulated the problem. He wanted to actuate the appendages to have the torso track desired torso trajectories. So imagine if we say, okay, torso, we want you to rotate like this. And we do that 50 times randomly. How do you find the tail trajectory that gets you as close as possible to that goal trajectory for the torso, okay? And so we've got a metric there, which is squared tracking error. That's the cost function on torso orientation. And then we have some equations for the system dynamics. And then we have constraints for position and velocity for each of those links. We have input constraints and input rate constraints. And then we have the total control effort constraint. And so what this is saying is that even if you have tails that differ in morphology, you are limited to using the same amount of control for both morphologies, okay? So just because you have more links, you don't get to use more control, okay? So this is how we're saying this is more fair. And then there's no self-collision constraint. The way we implemented this is using Hermite-Simpson direct collocation, and then we varied that initial condition. So Shun made 50 desired torso trajectories, and this is the rotation in pitch, which is kind of like this lizard, that pitch-up lizard. In roll, which we see in geckos that are doing that self-righting maneuver. And then in yaw, which is what the jerboas do, right? They swing around and then they yaw. And so each of these lines represents one of those trajectories. And so let's take you through one of those lines. So here we have highlighted one of those lines. And we have 3 moments in time that I'm going to go through. So these are the 3 moments. And the first moment in time, we have our torso here in space, in 3D space, pitch, roll, and yaw. That second moment in time, it kind of pitches up and rolls a little bit. And then in the third moment in time, it's almost completely changed direction. Okay, so these are the trajectories. So basically, we've got our torso, we've got our tail. The optimization is saying, what tail motion is best to track that complex trajectory as closely as possible, okay? And so the way that we measure that, remember, is with the error. So we're measuring the tracking error between the goal trajectory and the realized trajectory. And what we find is that if we have the tail link number here, so this is just a simple, rigid, 1-link tail, and this is the tracking error, if we increase to 2 links, our tracking error substantially decreases. And then if we add more links, it decreases more as well. So there is an advantage to having a more complex tail and having more joints in the tail, but we get diminishing returns. So here we've got, you know, a huge decrease and then smaller and smaller and smaller decreases. So what we find is that more links lowers that tracking error, but this improvement diminishes. And this is because the control effort constraint is primarily responsible for the diminishing returns. So here we have all of the different kind of physical parameters, and the orange bars represent that constraint level. And then each of these gray lines represents one of the trajectory traces through time. And what we see is that the torque, the joint angle, and the joint velocity, they're kind of going all over the place, but the control effort for a 6 degree of freedom robot is always right near that constraint, right near that limit. And so that's really the limiting factor for us. Okay, so what that means is that probably as animals evolve more and more complex tails, they probably have to evolve more and more complex control for that tail to actually get the real benefit of that tail. Okay, but there's some differences here between this simulated robotic tail and real tails. For one thing, this is considering a totally uniform set of links across the whole tail. Every single link is the same. But we have some collaborators at UCSD who are developmental biologists, and together we're doing a survey across all mammal tails. And what we find is if we look at vertebra number here, and then we look at the relative vertebral length, they start off really, really small, they get big, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we call this a crescendo and a decrescendo. So your link size changes as you go along the length of the tail. Is this just an accident, or is this something that actually has a function? Let's find out. So the next thing Shun did was, so he's got this uniform optimization working, Next, he allowed the ratio of those joint lengths to vary, okay? And as the length varies, we're assuming that the density is consistent. So as the length varies, so does the mass. And so you've got that total length and total mass constraint. It stays the same. So when he varied the tail lengths, we've got our 2 and our 3 and our 4 uniform here for comparison. We added in the varied lengths, and we get a slight benefit to varying those lengths. These error bars are huge right now because we only have 50 trials. I am asking Shun to continue running these until he no longer has access to the servers. So we're going to try and get those error bars as small as possible and see if we can get to a significant value. I don't think 50 is enough, but I do think that the benefit is real. Okay, so if that variable tail length is helpful, what is the optimal design for that tail? How should I make those tail links? How should I arrange them? Well, so for the 2-link tail, the first one should be a little bit smaller than the second one. In the 3-link tail, the first one should be small, the second one should be the longest, and then the third one can be a little smaller. In the 4-link tail, we still see that maximum length at number 2. So you start off small, and then you get big really quickly, and then you drop off. Sound familiar? It's that crescendo, decrescendo, right? So we asked Carrie and Kim for more of their data, and it turns out that if we take a look at mouse-like animals, their tails, their lengths start off at kind of 1, and they just kind of like peter off. But if you look at animals that are specifically doing inertial maneuvering with their tails, they have the steepest crescendo and decrescendo of any of the mammals that we have in our 400 species data set. So it's really exciting for us that our optimization recapitulated the pattern that we see across mammals. It seems like this pattern of crescendo and decrescendo actually has a function. And so we're really excited to explore this more and use this for design. Okay, so how does actuation actually affect inertial maneuvering control? There's another big difference between these models and how real systems work. So in the model, we assumed that every single joint could be independently actuated at that joint. But the way that real mammal tails work is they're tendon-driven systems. So this is a squirrel, this is the inside of a squirrel's fluffy tail. Mammals are different from lizards because mammals have butts, lizards don't. And the butts are all of our muscles that actuate our tails. In the tail, we actually have very skinny tails, and those are the cables, those are the tendons that insert on each of those vertebrae. All of the muscles for the tail are up in the butt. And so it's basically, you can model it as a cable-driven system. This is one of the few papers that actually draws out the tendons, because most people, when they look at the anatomy of a mammal, they dissect it out, they map it out, and they're like, okay, this is the arm, this is the leg, this is the body, this is the face, and then the tail's really complicated and it just kind of repeats. We're not going to write that down. This is one of the few. There may be 2. So I hired a postdoc, Juri Miyamai. She is an incredible anatomist. She's a dissection expert. She's a paleontologist. And I said, hey, can you take a look at the muscle tendon architecture inside of the tail of the jerboa? I want to know what's going on here. And she said, okay, something really weird. I've never seen this before. There are so many tendons, and they go all along. And so when you pull on these tendons, they're not just doing like a simple curvature here. They're forming these very complex curves as you just pull 2 tendons, okay? And so we wanted to know, how should we actually model the actuation of this system? How should we model the non-independence of the actuation of every joint, right? So how do we do that? We can use OpenSim modeling. So OpenSim is a method, hopefully some of you have heard of it, where you can take like a CT scan of bones and you can model in digitally the path of every muscle tendon unit and then play it through time. You can add in the kinematics and the dynamics, and it's really, really helpful for understanding how the morphology of a system translates into kinematics and dynamics and how muscle activation patterns can affect that. So people have made lots and lots of these models for humans, especially for clinical purposes, but they've also made them for animals too, other non-human animals. They've got it for mice. Notice what's missing in that mouse. They've got it for a dog. Notice what's missing in the dog. They've got it for dinosaurs. Notice what's missing in the dinosaur. And they've got it for cats. Notice what's missing in the cat. No one has made an OpenSim model of the tail. Why is this? So we started making an OpenSim model of the tail. And we thought, this is going to be easy. We'll finish it in a year. Nope. There are some really big challenges. Before we could get started making this OpenSim tail model, we realized that this is a big challenge for all of the existing OpenSim model making tools. So all of the software is optimized for these limb systems where you have maybe like a biarticular muscle, maybe, but most of them just span one joint. And so you have to put in each one of those muscles individually, right? But you don't have too many in a leg, so it's okay. Here we have so many joints, like 20 to 30 joints, right? We have extrinsic muscles over here that span across multiple joints. And we have to manually add each of those. And Jerry made a discovery, which is that we have branched muscle tendon architectures. So if we take a look at this one muscle, take a look at these gold fibers that come out of that muscle representing the tendon. We have, there we go. Here we are. We have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different insertion points from one single muscle because of this complex branch architecture. We looked in the literature, no one has figured out how to model this because we don't understand how the stresses are transferred across this complex system of tendons. And this was really, really difficult. And so before we could even get started on making this model, Shun had to invent a whole new model building software for OpenSim models of tails. So I want to explain to you what it is, and he was mentoring a student, undergraduate student Jack Withers, to do this. So the output is going to be this OpenSim musculoskeletal model. And there are lots of functionalities. I'm not going to go into all of them, but there's automatic joint creation. So you put in your landmarks, it automatically puts things into landmark space or joint space. There's automatic muscle tendon unit creation based on the landmarks that you put in. There's automatic body transformation. There's a lot of stuff, but what I really want to talk about is this new branching modeling method. Okay, so we looked in the literature, we talked to some folks like OpenSim fellows, and we found out that, yeah, we've got biceps, we've got triceps. They're kind of a little bit more complex, right? We've got multiple heads of muscles. How do people model these normally? So if you've got your muscle tendon structure, you've got your origin up there, you've got your muscle there in pink, and then you've got your branched system. This is the real system. If you look at the conventional way that people model this with OpenSim, you have a separate muscle tendon unit representing each one of these branches independently. So they're in parallel, and there's no interaction between these different muscle tendon units. And you just take the force and you divide it. You take the force of that muscle and you divide it by maybe cross-sectional area, for example. We think that this is maybe insufficient because if you have something like a tail, right, and then I externally am rotating this, maybe you hit something with your tail, I'm rotating this without touching any of the other stuff, this is going to change and affect the strain on the rest of that muscle tendon system, right? So there is interaction, And especially if we want to model contact, we have to take it into account. And so Shun came up with this way, which is to add these floating bodies and to add ligament elements. Okay, ligaments are just usually what we have for bone to bone, but he added them. You can give them the same properties as the tendons in this muscle tendon unit. And by having these floating bodies, you can connect the ligaments together to create this complex tendon branching system and connect it to a muscle. Okay, so we've done this, and I was thinking, okay, this is great. If I move this here, we're going to be able to get a sense for how this affects the whole system. But we're really wondering, is this just relevant for tails? Or is this relevant for other things? So when is it actually important to consider branching in your MTUs? You could think of a system in which you have many branches or few branches. So if you have many branches, do you have to? Like if it's more than 3, do you have to? Or if it's just two, can you get away with just your parallel system, right? Because that would be easier. What about if you have a different number of joints between the insertions, right? If you have 3 or 4 joints in between, is it worse than if they're right next to each other? We don't know. What about the muscle fiber length versus the MTU length, that muscle tendon unit length? So if you have a really large muscle compared to teeny tiny tendons, does that matter more than if you have a tiny muscle and really large tendons? We want to know. And so we created in simulation comparisons between the kinematics of each of these different systems when we added in the exact same muscle actuation patterns. Okay? So this is a preview of what the data are going to look like. This is that 3D model. You can see the tendons on that side there. It's just like itty bitty line there in blue. This is the 0 pose beginning initial condition. This is the extreme pose. If everything is like at its max range of motion, this is what it looks like. And what you'll see is if there is any difference between the conventional unbranched method, which we'll show in gray, and the proposed branched method that we show in green, you'll see differences. So they start at the same place, and then they'll change, right? So you can visually see the difference between these, but we measured it quantitatively by measuring the total curvature of each one of those systems and taking those like joint by joint differences between the curvatures. So what are our expectations? If there's no difference between these 2 different modeling methods, we'll see 0 across all of our results. And we'll be like, okay, you don't need ArborSim, it's okay. If we see a linear relationship, then probably you don't need ArborSim either. You can just sort of solve using your parallel and then just kind of use a scalar and scale the outputs. And it's very predictable and it's fine. But if we see something like this, then it's not predictable, and you do really need ArborSim to get those real dynamics, that real kind of strain field. Okay, let's look at some results. So this is for tendon branch count. So here we have 2 branches. Over there, we have all the way up to like 6 branches. And so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll play the video now. And you'll see the same muscle activation pattern is causing some significant differences between the 2 model morphologies. Right? The only thing that's changing is that branching structure. The material properties are the same, the lengths are the same, everything. It's just that structure. Okay, next let's look at tendon branch count. Oops. Yeah, or the joints between the insertions. So 2 joints between the insertions and then 6 joints. Again, you'll see, okay, some big differences, but not everywhere. And then let's look at that MTU, the muscle fiber length versus the muscle tendon unit length. So here we have a teeny muscle, big tendons, and over there, giant muscle, teeny tendons. Okay, you do see some differences, but maybe not as pronounced. So what do the results look like in our little plots? So this is tendon branch count, joint count between insertions, and then muscle fiber length to MTU length. What we find is that it is not predictable. So it is really important to actually model those those tendon strain fields in the right way. So we've got this jumping around, especially for these joint count between insertions. But for muscle fiber length versus MTU length, maybe it doesn't make as much of a difference. So maybe you can get away with it. But this actually is like really exciting for us because it means that we can make more accurate models of this system. But the next step is to actually put in the values for each of those different parts of the system, right? So we want to know how forces are transmitted through these complex tendon architectures. So we've got a collaboration with Charlie Andreasen and John Estrada, who are material, like tissue testers, right? They study the mechanics of biological materials. So they have DMA, which is dynamic mechanical analysis. So we've given them Jerboa tendons, which they tattoo. And then we look at as they stretch to give us a sense for how the strain changes across that whole system. And then we've got all kinds of other things, like we've got ossifications inside of the tendons that we're using objective lens microscopy to understand how that might affect the transfer of those stresses across these like tendon bone units. We're also, based on this paper, we're looking at how varying the load on one of the branches affects the stress-strain relationship on the other branches. So we'll be able to get values for every single one of those like tendon units. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually integrate inertial maneuvering with bipedal locomotion to actually do control on both. And so with some collaborators at UCSD, they are making the hind limb model and we're making the tail model. This is the progress that we have on the tail model already. And so we'll have the first fully articulated tail and leg model together, and we'll be able to do some really cool controls on it to find out, okay, if we were to make a bipedal robot with a tail, would we be able to stabilize it with a tail? Would we be able to do some really agile motion with the tail? And if we do, how should we build it? And how should we control it? So this is the next step and the next kind of big generation in my lab. So this is all which you've seen in the second half. This is all from Shun and his collaborations with Jury and with Jack. And so if you're looking for a postdoc, he's definitely on the market. All right, so hopefully we'll be able to make some robots that can move a little bit more like this in the future. So we're really hoping that this will aid in design. All right, I want to thank my lab. They're really, really awesome, and I really enjoy hanging out in my lab because my students are so cool. These are all the postdocs and the graduate students. But these are all of the undergrads that I've worked with through, and some of the grad students, master's students I've worked with throughout the years. I've been really, really lucky to have some pretty fantastic students. And no scientist is an island, so I really want to thank my communities and my funding agencies for my research, and then I'll leave you with my design philosophies for bio-inspired robotics. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. That was a really, really interesting talk. I hope you are all bio-inspired. We have a good amount of time for some questions, so raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. Harish.
It's very interesting to see some of the technology worked in reverse to what I would have used because I was interested in flexible arms. Mm-hmm. And so you have one mechanical arm and it bends. But the most efficient way to analyze that is, or one of the more efficient ways, is to use modal examples. And have you considered that as a way to make the modeling more efficient?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. We haven't used modals. We've actually investigated using Koopmanism. So taking this really, really complex dynamical system, lifting it into infinite dimensions to linearize the dynamics so that we can do more control and optimization on that higher dimensional model, or in the infinite dimensional model. So the other thing is that with the tails, they're not doing kind of the same thing all the time. Every single movement is different. So it's really difficult for us to find repeatable patterns and then kind of like group those together. So it's why we're kind of taking this slightly different approach. But yeah, this is really cool. I'll go back and talk to my lab and see what they think. Thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting and fun talk. I really appreciated it. I was curious about the involvement of legs in inertial maneuvering and other limbs. So you have isolated the role of the tail and you are studying it, especially when you're studying it in animals. I'm curious about, do you suspect any sort of confounding interactions between the limbs and the tail? Is there any cost to isolating the tail alone?
This is such a good question, and it is this is literally the next thing that my lab plans to do. But the limbs in the jerboa, they have really low moment of inertia, like even lower than the tail. So they've minimized the number of toes that they have. They only have 3 toes, and their bones are so thin, they're like birds. And so yes, they are moving their legs around, and there's potential to have some amount of inertial maneuvering, but I think it's really low compared to the tail, just because of the speed of the tail and the range of motion of the tail is much, much larger. Thank you.
Such a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I noticed when you were looking at the morphology of the tail and you were showing where the linkages connect in with the different bone elements, it was all in this kind of like 2D space. Are they actually connected only in that one planar space, or are they actually connecting in different areas that allow for that more 3-dimensional rotations that you see in the videos?
Yeah, so this is something that is forcing us to there are some standards and some like general accepted ways in which people do kind of anatomical analyses of muscle tendon architecture, and it's usually you preserve that specimen in like alcohol with formalin, and then it really like it dries things up in a specific way that makes them still pliable. But what we found is that it makes it really difficult to find that precise tendon morphology, and so we've had to work with fresh specimens. And so we've been working with roadkill. Anytime we find roadkill, we bring it into the lab, and then we do the dissection right there, and we have to do it really quick before it gets smelly. And what we're finding is that, yes, they're going into they have these strings that go along a single plane, so they kind of have like channels that they go through. But there are some exceptions where they're kind of wrapping around on the different surfaces. And so you can get, by pulling one tendon, you can actually get complex 3D motion out of the tail. This is such a good question.
Hi, this is Yixiao. So I'm a faculty member from the industrial design. So basically, I'm really interested in the social robots. So I'm just wondering, because I see the tails, this kind of tendon-driven structure, they are really amazing. But what I see here in your research is that they mostly focus on the application of, let's say, how a squirrel could jump through from the trees to trees, right? Or from the stone to another stone, etc. But a few days ago, I saw a squirrel, who is trying to, I don't know, communicate with another squirrel.
Yes.
With its tail doing the funny things. I don't know, maybe it's showing some interest to the other squirrel. I'm not so sure, right? But I'm just wondering if that kind of emotional or social communications between the animals with their tails are kind of interesting to the robotics communities.
Absolutely, yeah. So we found by doing a lot of different experiments with the tails that they do have these kind of emotional responses that they express through their tails. So we were having the jerboas kind of run through, and we would encourage them to run through this track by blowing air at them. And if we did it too much, they would get very annoyed with us, and they would wag their tail in a really specific way to express their disapproval. And I've never seen it in any other context. You will also notice that the tails of the jerboas, I'll just go back to the beginning so you can see, but the tails of the jerboas, They actually have a white part of the tip and then a black at the very tip. And so we think that and when they're really happy and they're moving around, their tails go straight up as they move around. And so you see that in kangaroo rats that live in California as well. We don't know exactly what the function is, but we think that it's for communication, maybe for species recognition, maybe for some kind of emotion there too. And so that's oftentimes we'll see more diverse movements in emotional and communication than we see just for locomotion. So yes, that's a fantastic idea to examine more of their behaviors. Thanks. Greg?
Thanks for an awesome talk. I have two questions. One is, what do people know about motor control of a jerboa tail?
0.
Two is, what's the scaling of tails? So like, is there a size limit for the animal where a tail, I assume bigger things might not benefit as much from tails. That's
Right.
my instinct, but have you examined the scaling?
Yeah, so we are doing this total, like every mammal. We're looking at every single mammal group and looking at their tails with respect to their bodies. The largest animals that I can tell from like YouTube videos that I suspect are doing this inertial maneuvering with their tails are these langurs. They're monkeys that live in Vietnam and Cambodia, and they're about this big, and they have the sharpest crescendo and decrescendo in our data set at all. And they're really, really cool. They're extremely long, skinny tails. But that's the largest one I've seen so far. But I think that fundamentally, your moment of inertia of your tail to your moment of inertia to your body, that ratio, I think still is generally a really good baseline for estimating how well you would be able to do inertial maneuvering with your tail, regardless of what size you are. It's just about the ratio. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that we want to do with this OpenSim model is input those kinematics. We're going to get the dynamics, and then we'll be able to solve, hopefully, for a set of muscle actuation patterns that can get us that, and then see if we can then optimize it and make it better than what the jerboa would be doing. Great question.
So, very good talk. So, one of the, I guess, kind of a little bit of, coming out of that question was, one of the things I was wondering is that how, with the controlling of the tail, how much does the jerboa kind of do that reflexively versus kind of like, by conscious action?
This is a great question. We work really closely with our veterinarians. And so if for some reason, a jerboa is kind of stumbling over or like isn't looking as perky as normal, we will do some diagnostics. And so what they'll do is they'll anesthetize the jerboa, and we can lift up the jerboa. Usually if the jerboa is awake and doing all this stuff, we lift it up and we flip it, and it moves its tail around like this, right? But then if it's anesthetized, if it's like done under general anesthesia, we lift it up and it's just limp. So it's not a reflex. It's fully conscious.
So then next thing on that one, so sometimes I see like the jerboa kind of like using its tail for balancing and whatnot, right? How much does the tail actually actively, reduce energy costs or whatever when it's doing locomotion and stuff like that?
Yeah, so based on my PhD work, I think that energetic cost of locomotion is not what they're trying to optimize at all. So what they have is an extremely costly locomotion. It's mainly muscle. It's like 90% muscle. And so they just do a few ginormous jumps that are super agile, and then they stop. And so we really think that the tail is there for helping with agility rather than reducing energetic cost of locomotion. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, maybe two.
Oh, thank you for a very fantastic talk. I'm very interested in OpenSim for the multi-articular muscles. And those muscles are not only found on the tail, but also like the neck muscle,
Yes.
especially for birds, or like the spinal muscle, and also very important for the snake muscles.
Yes.
Like, do you have any plan to do this kind of comparative study over that, like axle muscles?
This is a great question. I have many friends who do work in like swan necks and in snakes and things. I've basically built this tool so all my friends can use it. So you can use it too. It's posted on bioarchive, so it's live.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And I'm actually very interested in your suggestion in, what's some criterion like robot that can benefit from movements such as tail, or for example, maybe can you put like a swinging arm on like a mobile robot, and will that benefit? Or do you think that has something to do with, like, for example, if you put a tail on a humanoid, would that still benefit, given that the humanoid has higher degree of freedom, for example, on its core already? Or like, yeah, what's your suggestion in what type of robot to install a tail?
Yeah, I think that Aaron Johnson has put like a swinging arm that can be used as a manipulator. I think the paper is called More Than an Arm. And so it does swing it around and use it to induce these turns. So you're totally right. Anything can be an inertial appendage. And I think that the most effective design of a robot for an inertial appendage is something that has a lot of aerial time in its locomotion. So it's not necessarily the morphology of the robot, but actually the gait itself. So if you have huge aerial phases, you're going to be way better at inertial maneuvering, or you have more potential to benefit from inertial maneuvering. Thank you for the question.
Well, thank you all for the great questions. Let's give our speaker one more round of applause. All right, thank you all so much for coming.